Betrayal cuts deep, sharper than any blade, especially when it's delivered by those you love and trust most. Friends, family, those are supposed to be your constants, the ones you lean on when life gets heavy. But when it's someone within that circle who turns their back on you, the sting isn't just about broken trust. It feels like a well-planned attack, as if they conspired against you all along. That's the wound I was left nursing, and it took me far too long to even start healing. If it were up to me, I'd have walked away from some of my family members ages ago. Cut them out, clean and simple. But family isn't as easy to walk away from as a friend who betrays you. There are blood ties, memories, and obligations that keep pulling you back. I'm reminded of an old saying, one I can't quite place but have often found to be painfully true: you don't choose your family, but sometimes you wish you could. And if I'd had that choice back then, I wouldn't have hesitated to put some serious distance between me and my so-called loved ones. Growing up as the youngest in a family of 3 sons, I didn't exactly feel like the cherished baby that everyone assumes the youngest kid would be. Instead, I was practically invisible most of the time, overshadowed by my siblings, often getting nothing but leftovers, quite literally, when it came to meals. Food, clothes, attention, respect, I got the scraps, the hand-me-downs, and the menial tasks no one else wanted. It sounds trivial, but one memory sticks with me. I didn't taste white meat chicken until I was 14, and only because my oldest sibling had left for college, which meant more food on the table. Before that, anything good was taken by my brothers, and I was left with what remained. And when it came to chores, I wasn't Cinderella, but it sometimes felt that way. Before the days of remote controls, I was the designated channel changer no matter where I was in the house. If someone wanted the channel changed, they'd call for me, and I'd be expected to drop whatever I was doing to switch the TV for them. Then, one summer day, a moving truck rumbled down our street and parked outside the old Johnson house, just 3 doors down. My brother Wayne and I watched as a dark blue Chevy station wagon pulled up, and 4 figures climbed out: a man, a woman, a boy, and a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. I was only 8, but that girl made my heart pound and my stomach churn in ways I didn't yet understand. It was a feeling I'd come to know far too well in the years that followed. Wayne, my brother, wasted no time picking up on my reaction. With a mischievous grin, he started singing that old schoolyard rhyme, Jeffy and Blondie sitting in a tree, Kissing. He dragged out each letter, laughing at his own joke, while my face turned about as red as a tomato. I was just a kid, I barely knew what kissing even meant beyond what I saw in movies. But Wayne's teasing planted a seed of embarrassment that stuck with me. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't deny what he'd guessed. I had a crush on that girl, even though, at my age, crush felt like an overstatement. Girls were supposed to be gross and off-limits, especially for boys like me. But she wasn't just any girl. She was beautiful, with those piercing blue eyes and that golden hair that seemed to catch the sunlight just right. "Shut up, you idiot," I spat back, my cheeks burning, but he just laughed harder. "Oh, you think you're tough, huh?" he challenged, puffing up his chest like he'd done 1,000 times before. At 10, Wayne had both a size and a weight advantage over me. He'd proven his dominance in many little scuffles, and I wasn't stupid enough to think I could take him on. But with Blondie, Susan, I'd later learn her name was, standing right there, I didn't want to back down. There was no way I was going to look weak in front of her, even if she hadn't noticed me yet. As it turned out, Susan and her family were our new neighbors. She had an older brother named Eddie, who was around Wayne's age, and, being the only kids on the block, it was natural that our families ended up spending time together. Susan was closer to my age, so we ended up playing together more than the others. She wasn't a girly girl, which was a good thing because she could throw a football as well as any of us boys. Soon enough, Susan and I became practically inseparable, sharing everything from secrets to snacks, and I couldn't imagine a day without her by my side. As we grew older, our friendship only deepened. Susan wasn't just my friend, she was my best friend, the person I could talk to about anything. My feelings for her had grown, too, though I kept them to myself. She'd reach over sometimes and hold my hand, just for a moment, and my heart would pound like it was about to jump out of my chest. Of course, the other guys at school never let me hear the end of it, but I didn't care. I held her hand proudly, even if it was just for a brief second here or there. I thought she felt the same way, at least, I wanted to believe that. But then, as 8th grade was coming to a close, everything shifted. One day, Susan mentioned, almost casually, that she'd been invited to the freshman mixer by Josh Archer, the high school quarterback. My heart sank, but I tried to play it cool, forcing a smile that didn't come close to reaching my eyes. I thought we were kind of together, I mumbled, my voice barely above a whisper, trying to hide the tremble as I spoke. Her eyes softened, but her answer felt like a slap in the face. "But you never actually asked me to be your girlfriend, Jeff," she replied, smiling that beautiful smile of hers. "Besides, he's a high school guy, and the quarterback. This is a huge deal." "Yeah, whatever," I muttered, brushing past her, feeling the hurt boil inside me. I wanted to say more, to make her understand how much she meant to me, but the words wouldn't come. I trudged home, feeling like my world had crumbled. I tried to hold back tears as I reached the front door, but my brother Wayne was there, smirking like he knew exactly what had happened. "Blondie got you good, huh?" he taunted, his voice laced with mock sympathy. It was clear he found the whole situation amusing. Even when our mom grounded him for using a swear word to describe her, it didn't make me feel any better. My mom tried to console me, saying it was just one date and didn't mean anything, that she'd still be my friend. But I didn't buy it. The week leading up to the mixer, I made myself scarce, avoiding her house, her calls, and any chance to run into her. But on the night of the dance, I couldn't resist the urge to sneak a peek. From my window, I saw Josh Archer's dad pull up to her house to pick her up. She looked stunning, all dressed up and smiling. They made a perfect pair, and the sight made my heart sink even deeper. Wayne returned a little while later with a snide grin on his face. "They looked great together, didn't they?" he sneered. I wanted to punch him in that moment, but I just turned away, feeling the hurt settle in my chest. That summer, life was different. Susan and I didn't talk much after that night of the dance, and as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't keep hanging around her like I used to. She'd moved on to high school life and everything that came with it, new friends, new experiences, and, apparently, new guys. I, on the other hand, felt like I'd lost something irreplaceable. Our occasional waves across the street were polite, but it wasn't like before. No more late afternoon talks, no more playing catch in the yard, and definitely no more hand-holding. I was miserable, but I could see she wasn't. She seemed happy, unbothered, and that just made it worse. I focused on other things to keep my mind off her. I spent hours at the baseball field, practicing until my arms felt like they would fall off. If I wasn't there, I was shooting hoops, playing until the sun dipped below the trees and I could barely see the ball. I poured everything into sports, hoping that maybe if I was good enough, strong enough, I'd stop caring about her. And for the most part, it worked. I had my moments where I'd catch myself thinking about her, but by then, I'd throw myself back into whatever game I was in, using the hurt as fuel. Wayne, of course, didn't let me forget. Anytime he heard something about Susan and another guy, he'd make sure to rub it in. "Guess who Blondie was out with last night?" he'd say, always grinning, knowing exactly what kind of reaction he'd get from me. It didn't matter how much I tried to shrug it off or pretend it didn't bother me, he saw right through it. I could only hope that one day he'd get a taste of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of this kind of pain. But back then, Wayne was untouchable, too clever and too cruel to let anything get to him. At least I had Diana, my sister, who tried to shield me from his taunts. She'd tell Wayne to back off, to leave me alone. "Look who's talking, Wayne. You're not exactly a ladies' man yourself," she'd snap, but it only stopped him for a minute before he was back to his old tricks. He even had the nerve to say he might ask Susan out himself, just to mess with me. I couldn't believe he'd actually say that, and I remember snapping, "If you go out with her, you'll regret it." But before I knew it, my dad's hand came down hard on my face, knocking the air out of me and sending a burning pain through my cheek. He turned to Wayne, warning him not to mess with Susan, but the slap left me reeling. I'd barely been able to process it. My father, the man I looked up to, the man who rarely even raised his voice, had slapped me for standing up to my brother. The whole family was now tangled up in this strange power play over a girl who'd once been my best friend. That summer changed everything. By the time freshman year rolled around, things had changed for me in ways I hadn't expected. Up until then, I'd barely been a blip on the radar for most girls. But over that summer, I hit a growth spurt, shooting up 4 inches and packing on about 25 pounds. Now, I stood at a solid 6 feet, with a more muscular build from all that time spent at the baseball field and basketball court. I didn't think much of it, but apparently, other people did. Suddenly, girls who'd never given me a second glance were striking up conversations, laughing a little too loudly at my jokes, and finding reasons to sit near me in class. It was a shock, to say the least, and, honestly, I was thrown off at first. The attention felt strange, like it wasn't meant for me, but I couldn't deny that I enjoyed it. My confidence grew a little each day, and soon enough, I started going out with a few different girls. There was one in particular who caught my eye, a petite, lively redhead named Erin with the brightest green eyes I'd ever seen. She had this infectious energy and a laugh that could light up a room. It didn't take long for her to become my first real girlfriend, and let's just say things progressed quickly. She was on the freshman cheerleading squad, and we became somewhat of a couple around school. Every now and then, I'd spot Susan in the hallway, and she'd give me this strange look, a mix of surprise and something I couldn't quite place, but I brushed it off. After all, she'd moved on long before I did. With Erin, things were light and easy. She wasn't complicated, she didn't have hidden layers or old memories that made everything feel heavier. And to be honest, that was exactly what I needed. My relationship with Susan had been too raw, too personal, and the hurt too fresh. Erin was my way out, my distraction, my first real taste of life without Susan. We spent most of our time together, and I finally started to feel like maybe I was moving on. The Christmas dance that year felt like a turning point. Erin looked stunning, her bright red hair catching the lights in the gym, her smile wide and real. She was all mine, and for the first time, I didn't feel a pang of regret about Susan. That night, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could be happy without her. Erin made me feel good about myself, and she never reminded me of what I'd lost. But life has a way of stirring up old feelings when you least expect it. Just 2 days after the Christmas dance, my mom knocked on my door and announced, "You have a visitor, Jeff." When I looked up, there she was, Susan, standing in my doorway, looking almost as nervous as I felt. As my heart thudded in my chest, she walked in and sat down, and for the first time since that summer, I could see that same girl I'd been so close to. But I also knew things would never be as simple as they once were. Susan sat down on the edge of my bed, her gaze shifting nervously around the room. I closed my book, trying to act casual, but my pulse was racing. I hadn't been alone with her in months, and here she was, sitting across from me like no time had passed, as if the dance, the heartache, and the months of silence hadn't happened. After a moment, she looked straight at me, her expression softer, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen. "Jeff, I made a mistake last year," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Going out with Josh. That wasn't fair to you. I should have told you how I felt, but I was too scared. I wanted to fit in, to feel like I mattered." Her words hung in the air, each one tugging at old wounds I thought I'd patched over. I wanted to tell her that what she'd done hurt me more than she could understand, that it had taken me months to even look at her without feeling betrayed. But instead, I sat there, silent, letting her speak, needing to hear what she'd come to say. "I've been out with other guys, Jeff," she continued, looking down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. "But it's not the same. You were always there for me, and I took that for granted. I don't want anyone else, I want us to be together." There was a vulnerability in her voice that tugged at something deep inside me. Part of me wanted to jump up, take her in my arms, and let all the hurt and resentment melt away. But another part, a wary, bruised part, held me back. I knew I needed to protect myself, to set boundaries, so I took a steadying breath before I replied. If we're going to be together, Susan, there can't be any more guessing games. No what-ifs, no maybes. If you're my girlfriend, then that's it. I don't want to hear about any other guys, and I don't want to see you running off with someone else just because they're popular or exciting. You have to mean it. She nodded quickly, her blue eyes bright with something close to relief. I understand, Jeff. I really do. I promise it'll be just us. No one else. But there was one last thing I had to handle before anything could move forward. I thought of Erin, the sweet, cheerful girl who'd been my companion and distraction when I needed it most. She deserved better than to be left in the dark, so I told Susan I needed to speak to Erin before we could really be together. Susan nodded, her expression softening. I get it, Jeff. And I know it's my fault you're even in this position. I wish I'd realized sooner. There was a sadness in her eyes that made me think she understood how much damage she'd done. Breaking up with Erin was tough, but she handled it gracefully. Though I could tell she was hurt, she seemed to understand that I had unresolved feelings for Susan. And so, just like that, Susan and I were officially together. This time, with no secrets, no unspoken questions, and no Josh Archers in the way. For a while, things were good. Really good, in fact. Susan and I picked up right where we'd left off, only now we were a real couple, sharing everything from whispered conversations to shy kisses. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to start fresh. I couldn't believe how lucky I was to have her back, and I told myself that this time, I'd do whatever it took to keep her close. But as we grew older, I'd come to find that even the strongest bonds don't always last. And sometimes, the cracks that once seemed small can splinter everything apart. Our relationship felt like a dream come true, but being young and in love has its own challenges, especially when families get involved. Susan and I were inseparable all through high school, and by our senior year, we'd already started making plans for college together. I felt on top of the world with her by my side. She was my first real love, the one who made my heart race and my head spin. But as much as we meant to each other, we didn't live in a bubble. Our families had their opinions, and those opinions weren't always kind. Wayne, in particular, was a constant thorn in my side. Anytime he saw us together, he'd throw out some snide comment or make a crude joke. So, how's little Jeffy treating you, Susan? He'd ask, grinning like he was the funniest guy in the room. It wasn't just teasing, though. It was like he was looking for a way to get under my skin, to find some way to ruin what Susan and I had. Then, one night at a family gathering, Wayne pushed things too far. The music was playing, people were dancing, and for once, I thought we'd get through an evening without any drama. But as Susan and I swayed together to a slow song, I noticed Wayne moving toward us, a smirk plastered on his face. Before I knew it, he'd cut in, taking Susan's hand and pulling her close as I stood there, stunned. He whispered something in her ear, and whatever he said made her laugh, a genuine, open laugh. My chest tightened with anger, and I stormed over, grabbing Wayne by the shoulder. "That's enough, Wayne," I growled, my voice shaking. But he just laughed, giving me that smug look I'd come to hate. "What's the matter, little brother?" "Afraid she might like me better," he taunted. That was it. Without thinking, I swung at him, my fist connecting with his jaw before anyone could react. The room fell silent, gasps echoing around us as I stood there, breathing hard, the anger and frustration of years boiling over. Wayne staggered back, blood dripping from his lip, but he just laughed, wiping his mouth like it was all a joke. Our dad, who rarely intervened in our fights, stormed over, pulling us apart. He fixed Wayne with a cold glare, his voice tight and angry. "You mess with Susan again, and I'll make sure you regret it," he warned, his words like a slap in the face to Wayne. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of triumph. But as I looked over at Susan, I saw a hint of hesitation in her eyes, a hesitation that haunted me for the rest of the night. I'd stood up for her, yet she hadn't pulled away from Wayne, hadn't refused his dance. And though I tried to shake it off, a tiny seed of doubt was planted that night. After that night, things felt different. Susan and I carried on, but I couldn't shake the memory of her laughing with Wayne, or that flicker of doubt in her eyes. We'd been through so much together that I thought nothing could come between us, yet somehow, that moment stayed with me, like a splinter lodged too deep to pull out. Still, I didn't let it show. I pushed those thoughts down, burying them beneath the certainty that she loved me and that I loved her. High school ended, and Susan and I took the next step together, heading off to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. We chose the same college intentionally, making plans to be close, to build our future side by side. Susan lived just one floor above me in the dorms, and soon enough, we were spending nearly every waking moment together. By the time our sophomore year rolled around, we moved in together in a small off-campus apartment. It felt like our own little world, like everything I'd hoped for was finally becoming real. Our parents knew about our arrangement, and while they didn't entirely approve, they didn't fight us on it either. Susan assured her parents she'd stay on birth control until after college, a compromise that seemed to ease their minds. My parents, on the other hand, seemed quietly relieved, as though they'd been waiting for Susan and me to make our commitment official. And so, midway through our sophomore year, I proposed. I'd saved up from odd jobs and scrimped to afford a modest ring, one I hoped would show her how much she meant to me. I remember the way her face lit up when I slipped it on her finger, her hands trembling as she said yes. It was one of the happiest moments of my life, and for a while, everything was perfect. Our wedding was small but beautiful. Both families came together, putting aside their differences for a day, celebrating as we exchanged our vows. I remember looking at her, thinking that we'd finally made it, that we'd overcome every obstacle life had thrown our way. But, as the reception wound down and guests began to leave, Wayne found a way to make his mark. As the music played softly in the background, he approached Susan, catching her off guard. Before I could even react, he'd placed his hand on her back, a little too low, his fingers grazing where they had no business being. From across the room, I saw her laugh it off, maybe assuming he was just drunk or overly friendly. But to me, it was clear what he was doing. Without a second thought, I crossed the room, yanked his hand off her, and punched him square in the mouth. He stumbled back, shocked, as a trickle of blood smeared across his lip. "I warned you," I hissed, my voice low but cold. "You don't ever lay a hand on my wife." Guests hurried to separate us, and the evening resumed, but a strange unease lingered. I couldn't help but notice that Susan hadn't really reacted, hadn't done anything to stop Wayne, even as he crossed the line. And though we moved past it, settling back into our lives, I couldn't quite ignore the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was the only one truly fighting to keep our marriage sacred. After the wedding, Susan and I returned to our hometown, ready to start our life together. I'd landed a job as an editor for a local magazine group, and Susan began working for a nonprofit. We were finally building the future we dreamed of, and for a while, everything seemed to fall into place. A couple of years later, we welcomed our first child, Marianne, followed by our son, Will, 2 years after that. Becoming parents brought us even closer, and I felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. Susan had always been beautiful, but motherhood gave her a new kind of radiance, one that made me fall in love with her all over again. Despite our busy schedules and new responsibilities, we still made time for each other, hitting the gym together, sharing long walks, and prioritizing our relationship. We weren't wealthy, but my job paid enough for Susan to stay home with the kids. I felt lucky to have a beautiful wife, 2 amazing children, and a stable life. I told myself I was one of the fortunate ones, someone who had found real, lasting happiness. But then, Wayne came back. He'd moved to California years earlier, climbing the ranks in television advertising sales. From what I heard through family, he was doing well, living in a high-end neighborhood with his wife, though they didn't have kids. Wayne had always been a charmer, slick with words, and able to talk his way out of nearly anything. We didn't see each other much, which was fine by me. A little distance had helped keep the peace. I figured he was off doing his own thing, too busy with his flashy West Coast lifestyle to meddle in my life anymore. But one day, out of the blue, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was heavy, and I could tell she was holding back tears. Wayne had been diagnosed with lung cancer. It seemed impossible. He'd never smoked a day in his life, yet the doctors had given him 2 years at best. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. Despite everything, he was still my brother, and I couldn't shake the weight of knowing that his time was running out. Soon, Wayne's life began to unravel. His marriage crumbled as quickly as his health, with his wife leaving him, unwilling to stick around through his illness. He'd lost his flashy house in the divorce and was now living in a modest apartment, facing his illness alone. It was hard not to feel some sympathy, even after everything he'd put me through. Cancer doesn't discriminate, it just tears lives apart. And as much as I hated to admit it, Wayne needed family now more than ever. My mother, ever the caretaker, wanted to rally the family to support him. She called a family meeting, urging us to figure out a plan. Susan, my sister Diana, and my mom agreed that they'd each take turns staying with Wayne, helping him through his treatments and managing his daily needs. Given that Susan didn't have a job outside the home, she volunteered to spend the longest stints with him, a month at a time. I didn't love the idea of her being away from us, especially for Wayne, of all people, but I couldn't argue. He was family, and when family needs you, you step up. It'll be fine, Susan assured me. Marianne's old enough to help around the house, and Will has his sports to keep him busy. We'll manage. Besides, Wayne's going through enough, he deserves some comfort in his last days. I nodded, though something in me didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a nagging sensation, an unease that gnawed at me, though I told myself it was just the natural stress of the situation. We'd make this work, I had to believe that. We were strong. When Susan left for her first month-long stay with Wayne, the house felt emptier than I'd expected. She'd been my partner, my teammate, the one I leaned on, and now, suddenly, I was a solo parent, managing the household on my own. I reminded myself this was temporary, that Susan was doing something noble, helping a family member in need. But each night as I settled in alone, a strange, uneasy feeling would creep over me. The kids adjusted fairly quickly, though they missed their mom. Marianne, our eldest, took on more responsibilities, helping with Will's school runs and making sure things ran smoothly. Susan called us almost every other day, sharing little updates about Wayne's health. She told us he was still able to get around, but that he was more tired than usual. I could hear the weight in her voice, as if the reality of his illness was wearing her down. The calls were short, and while they were a comfort, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. When her month with Wayne ended, the kids and I went to the airport to pick her up. She looked tired, more than just the exhaustion of travel. I chalked it up to the stress of caring for someone with a terminal illness. Still, there was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before, like she was somewhere else even while standing right in front of me. We spent her 2-week break reconnecting, but in all honesty, something felt different between us, and no amount of reassuring myself could shake that feeling. Before I knew it, she was heading back to California for her next month with Wayne. She prepared meals for us ahead of time and left detailed instructions to keep things running smoothly. The kids and I managed well enough, but that unsettled feeling was growing. During her second trip, we had our usual phone conversations, but this time, Susan seemed even more distant. Her mind wandered during our talks, her responses growing shorter, her tone lacking the warmth I'd grown used to. I tried to remind myself of what she was going through. She was caring for a man facing his own mortality, a man who, despite everything, was still her brother-in-law. But a part of me couldn't help but wonder if it was more than just the strain of caring for Wayne. I'd lay awake at night, running through every possible scenario, every what-if that my mind could conjure. She was there for family, I reminded myself. She was there for a good reason. When she came back home after her second stay, I decided to go to the airport alone. On the drive there, I found myself anxious, a knot of tension building up as I pictured her walking toward me through the gate. As she approached, I noticed something different. She looked beautiful, as always, but there was an air of detachment about her, a distance that hadn't been there before. I went in for a kiss, but she pulled back just slightly, her smile faint, her gaze slipping away from mine. In the car on the drive home, we barely spoke. I could feel a wall between us, something I couldn't quite name, and I didn't know how to break it down. The kids were thrilled to have her back, and their excitement seemed to distract her from whatever was on her mind. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I finally asked her if Wayne's condition was getting to be too much. She sighed, giving me a tired look. "Jeff, he's dying. He doesn't have anyone else. I'm just tired. I'm here for him, for your family. It's a lot, that's all." The words hit me harder than I expected. Your family. Not ours, not hers. Mine. She was doing this as a duty, but the way she phrased it made it sound like a burden, like she was being pulled away from a life she might have preferred to be living elsewhere. It was the first night since our wedding that I went to bed feeling like maybe, for the first time, I was losing her. Susan's third stay with Wayne began to feel like the tipping point. She was more withdrawn, calling even less frequently, and when she did, her tone was strained, almost guarded. She told me Wayne's condition was worsening, that he needed more care, that things were getting harder for her, but something about the way she said it sounded hollow. Like there was something she wasn't saying. I could hear it in her voice, an edge, something lurking just beneath the surface. But every time I tried to bring it up, she deflected, saying it was nothing, that she was just tired. When she finally returned home after that third month, I'd planned a night just for us, dinner, a quiet evening without the kids, an attempt to rekindle the connection that felt like it was slipping away. But as the evening wore on, I felt like I was sitting across from a stranger. She was polite, smiling at all the right times, but her laughter was missing, her warmth had dimmed. We'd once been able to talk about anything, but now, she barely opened up. I felt like I was reaching for something I couldn't quite grasp. That night, as we climbed into bed, I tried to hold her, hoping that maybe we could find each other in the quiet intimacy that had always grounded us. But she turned away, saying she was exhausted, that she needed rest. The ache I felt went beyond disappointment. It was like a door had shut between us, and I didn't know how to open it. A few days later, as she was getting ready to leave for another stay with Wayne, my daughter Marianne approached me. She'd grown up fast these last few months, taking on responsibilities around the house, and she seemed to sense the shift in our family. Her words hit me like a jolt. "Dad, is something wrong with Mom?" she asked, her voice hesitant but direct. "She's been different. Is she okay with Uncle Wayne? Or is it more than that?" The question was both shocking and unsettling. Marianne was sharp, and it was clear she'd picked up on the same changes that had haunted me for months. She hesitated, then added, "Sometimes it feels like she's not really here with us, like her mind is somewhere else. And I've noticed the way she talks about Uncle Wayne. It's almost like, I don't know. She's always talking to him on the phone when she's home, like she's checking in constantly." Hearing it from her made my fears feel more real, dragging my doubts into the open. I didn't know what to say, so I told her it was probably just the stress of everything with Wayne, that her mom was struggling to keep up with the demands of caring for him. Marianne's gaze stayed steady on me, her expression unreadable, but I could see the worry in her eyes. As Susan prepared to leave once more, I felt a surge of frustration. I wanted to tell her not to go, to just stay home where she belonged, with her family. But the words felt selfish, tangled in guilt and fear that maybe, somehow, I was pushing her away. Instead, I simply reminded her to take care of herself, to remember that we needed her too, here at home. She looked at me with a faint smile, but her eyes held a kind of detachment I couldn't ignore. "I'm doing this for you, Jeff. For your family. Wayne's all alone out there. It's just something I have to do." As she walked through the airport gate, a hollow feeling settled in my chest. I watched her disappear down the terminal, feeling like I was losing her bit by bit, month by month, with each trip she took. I wanted to believe this was just a phase, that once Wayne's illness passed, everything would go back to the way it was. But a voice in the back of my mind warned me that maybe, just maybe, things had already gone too far.